This is our third session of Megillat Esther through the eyes of Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Rama, in his commentary called Mechir Yayin, in which he describes Megillat Esther as a metaphor for the human experience. Last time we had gone through the first chapter of Megillat Esther, and the Rama had explained that the first chapter of the Megillah describes a human being as a young, either adolescent or adult, somewhat consumed by its more base tendencies, its more physical desires, and that is represented by Vashti. Vashti is the queen, so we had explained, the Rama had told us that in using these metaphorical anthropomorphisms, the female characters in the Megillah represent the tendencies that the human personality has towards the physical world, and the male characters represent those parts of the human personality that has aspirations towards non-physical, perhaps what we would call intellectual or transcendent pursuits. And the human being is comprised of both, and the totality of the human being you cannot do with one without the other. But Achashverosh, which represents the the non-physical aspirations of the human being, is married to Vashti in his youth, that's the human being in his youth, and he is therefore drawn towards destructive behaviors, addictive behaviors, Vashti-like behaviors which cause the individual to realize that there's got to be something better out there. And so therefore the only option available in order to advance to the next level of maturity as a human being is to wipe out Vashti and start all over again. And we... What's that?
That's an advance.
Is
that an advance? Well, the way he did it.
Oh, well, again, we're dealing on a metaphorical level. So, but sometimes there has to be a violent departure and excision of my past. That's true. So that's where we're up to. And we're up to now chapter 2, which we're going to analyze tonight. And which starts with, if you have the Stone Chumash, it's on page 1253. And the Megillah writes, Achar hadivarim ha'eleh, after these events, Kishoch chamas hamelech Achashverosh, as the anger or the wrath or the passion of King Achashverosh begins to abate. And this is the death of Vashti. It represents the realization that I can no longer give in to my baser desires. And this is describing a time of man's life when his passions and his lusts begin to wane and he calms down and he realizes what has happened to Vashti. Zachares Vashti ve'es asher asasa. He realizes that all of his indulgences in the earlier parts of his life led him down a destructive path. And he realizes, you know what, it's time for me to get serious. And I should really get married, and I should start a family, and I should start thinking about a future for myself. And therefore he decides, Vayomeru in sentence number 2, Vayomeru na'arei hamelech misharisa, the advisors of the king, which represent the human faculties, the voices that a person hears in his head, the different mental faculties in your mind. Yivakshu lamelech ne'aros b'sulos tovos mareh. Let the king summon for himself maidens from which you can choose a wife, and you can find a true partner in life. And here, of course, the partner that we're dealing with is not just the female wife that a mature adult needs. He needs to enter into a marriage, whereas before he might have been living like a playboy. Now he's got to settle down right after he's sowed his wild oats. But here we're talking about finding a way to deal with the physical world in a much more healthy, wholesome fashion. That's what his next wife is going to represent, using the Vashti Esther analogy. Now, the Rama finds another connection to a piece of Gemara that many of us are familiar with. And if you're looking for a good vort for a wedding, let me tell you this piece of Torah. We know there's a famous Gemara in Masechet Sota that says, Ein mezavgin lo le'adam isha ela lefi ma'asav. that when it's time for a person to find a mate, Hashem in heaven matches a person a mate that is commensurate to his deservedness. So if he's a righteous man, he'll get a righteous woman, and vice versa. Now, the rabbis qualify that, and they say, the koshin lizavgan kekriyas yamsu. It is as difficult to join two people together as splitting the Red Sea. You're all familiar with that analogy. So then the Gemara asks, how can you tell me that it's as difficult to join two people together as splitting the Red Sea? V'ha'amar, Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, did not the rabbi say, Arboim yom kodem yitziras havlad, bas kol yoses ve'omeres, bas ploni leploni, bas ploni leploni, or bais ploni leploni, stay ploni leploni. Don't we know that there's a heavenly decree that preordains which person is going to marry which person? How can you tell me that a person's merits determine who he's going to marry if everything has already been preordained from before a person was born? So it should not be dependent upon a person's merits if it's already preordained even before I come into the world. That's what the Gemara asks as a question. The Gemara answers, Lo kasha ha bezug or bezivug rishon, ha bezug or bezivug sheni. The answer is, says the Gemara, that there are two types of marriage. There's the first marriage and then there's the second marriage. The first marriage is not dependent upon a person's piety. The first marriage is who your mazel determines you're going to marry. The second marriage, says the Gemara, is based upon your righteousness, based on your deservedness. That's how the Gemara understands that. And of course, there's a lot of Torah that's been discussed about how a righteous man, even the first time he gets married, will find a righteous wife. And we hear this being spoken about under the chuppah all the time. It's important to point out that the Arizal said that because of the belief in reincarnation, everyone in this world today is up to zivug sheni, is up to their second marriage in some way or another. But we'll put that aside for now. The Rama says that the deeper meaning of this Gemara when we talk about zivug rishon versus zivug sheni is that when a person is born, each and every one of us is created with predispositions in our personality. Some people are born with more anxiety, some people with less. Some people are born with a stronger temper, some people with less. Some people have shpilkas, and some people are very calm and can focus much better than others. That's the early stage of our life, and it's at that stage of life that we talked about in chapter 1 where I court my Vashti. My Vashti are those physical predispositions and predilections that I was born with, that I come into the world with. What true maturity is that when I realize what my flaws are in my God-given personality, and I'm able to put aside those flaws that manifest themselves in the Vashti of my life, and then I'm able to take a new wife, to be able to associate myself with new areas of my personality that I develop based upon hard work that is rooted in piety, that's rooted in righteousness. And many times as we become older, we are able to identify, these are the problems that I have in my personality. I'm too judgmental. I'm arrogant. I'm given to losing my temper. I open my mouth and say things before I think about them, right? Can you relate to those ideas? And we slowly train ourselves to transform ourselves into what we would consider to be a better person. That's the zivug sheni that the Gemara is describing. Zivug rishon is who we are based upon our God-given personality. Our zivug sheni, our second mate, so to speak, are those personality traits that we've spent much of our adult life trying to root out the bad and cultivate the good within ourselves. And that's the idea of Esther that we're going to encounter in the second chapter. That let the king find a new wife who will be a better wife. So, by the way, that's why the Gemara says it's as difficult to find a mate as it is to split the Red Sea. Because splitting the Red Sea means that God, obviously nothing is difficult for God, but when we say that it's as difficult as splitting the Red Sea, it's kavyachol. It's how we translate kavyachol. It's a way of saying things that even though God can do everything just as easily, it appears as if it's more difficult for Hashem to split the Red Sea than to cause the sun to rise, because it's a departure from the natural order. Anytime you and I depart from our natural order, it's considered to be of greater difficulty for the individual. That's why it's compared to splitting the Red Sea. This idea of marrying Esther and changing, transforming who I am, and becoming a better person, instead of going back to my old Vashti ways, is as difficult as splitting the Red Sea, because it's a departure from my natural order, from the person that I am.
His wrath side, it's more of his passion. Like the word.
Correct. That's correct. Correct. So it's the idea of passion. The passions of youth. Correct. Now, the reason why the name of this set of new character traits that I worked on during my adult life, we call that by the name of Esther. It's because, as we've explained previously, the woman in the narrative represents one's more physical side, one's tendencies that are associated with the physical world. But the mature adult is able to subjugate those tendencies and control them. The language of Esther, what does the word Esther come from? Lahastir, to hide or to suppress. And that is, I'm able to dominate my physical tendencies and to bring them under control. And that's all implied by the word Esther, which means to be covered. The human being who is trying to subvert his baser tendencies and control himself. Chazal also tell us, Esther yirakro kesaisa, v'chut shel chesed mashuch aleh. You know that famous Gemara that Esther was green? The Gemara says that Esther had a green complexion. Now, the Gemara, in the simple explanation, is merely just trying to explain that she was not particularly attractive from an objective standpoint of beauty, because women that have an olive or greenish kind of complexion are not the types of women that typically, at least not in this biblical period, you'd see their face posted on a modeling shoot or Esquire magazine or whatever it is, right? But nevertheless, chut shel chesed mashuch achareha, nevertheless, anyone who saw her immediately found something attractive within her, because her personality shone through, and that's what made her so attractive. Not the external initial view of her face, but it was the whole package that you could see something emerging from her that was truly beautiful. That's the simple understanding of the Gemara. But the Rama says that the idea of Esther having a green complexion is because the color green in and of itself, as is discussed in other places in the Gemara and other Kabbalistic works, represents the idea of moderation. Especially when you consider, the Rama says, the colors of the spectrum, the colors of the rainbow, the color green is right in the middle. Between the two extremes, red being on one side, purple being on one side, green is right there in the center to represent the idea of moderation. And this is what Esther represents. Not that I completely eschew my physical side, which is my Esther side, but rather that I'm able to control it and use it in a healthy way and use it in moderation. Also, the story of Esther is the story of a human being during his middle age, during the period of time between the time when he's a hot-headed young man and an older senior citizen. It's during that middle period of life, which is also represented by the color green. What Chazal mean when they say chut shel chesed mashuch achareha, that there was this attractive comeliness that was drawn upon her, is that in this, using this metaphor, only by the good graces of God does a person possess an intellect and a yetzer hatov and a good inclination that allows him to subjugate his baser desires into an Esther type of personality that is moderate and measured. And therefore, this idea of moderation requires the chut shel chesed, requires a gift from Hashem, because Hashem is showing his favor to us. In this vein, let's continue the story. So the officers of the king, the officers of man, are his faculties. From now on, find a stable personality and lifestyle that your body will be able to live healthily with, together with body and intellect. And specifically, we go now to Pasuk Gimel, and they suggest to the king, V'yafked hamelech pikidim, let the king send out officials, right, proxies, to go out to the entire kingdom and let them gather all of these beautiful maidens into Shushan, the capital, and let them bring them to the house of women through or under the control of a man named Haggai, who is a eunuch of the king, who is the guardian of the women. And so the Rama says the name Haggai is deliberate. Haggai was the man who was in charge of sort of supervising all of the women of Persia, because the word Haggai comes from the word lahagot, which means to verbally express an idea. And ultimately, the way a person speaks will manifest his character. And because the women of the kingdom have to be carefully chosen, I have to carefully choose my Esther, the physical parts of my personality that are going to act with moderation. One of the things that I have to get under control the most is the way that I communicate with others. And that's alluded to by the name Haggai. And then they conclude in Pasuk 4 and they say, V'hana'ara asher titav be'enei hamelech timloch tachas Vashti. Let the woman who finds favor in the eyes of the king, let her become the new queen instead of Vashti. And the king is very happy with this ideas. In other words, the set of behaviors and character that the individual chooses should be chosen with deliberation to make sure he emerges from his choices as a wise and well-behaved individual. And then the Torah tells us the story about a new character that comes into the Megillah. And that is a man whose name is Mordecai. Ish Yehudi Haya b'Shushan Habira. There was a Judean in the capital of Shushan. His name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish, a man from Binyamin. We're not going to have a chance to go through all of the different names that come from the name Mordecai, but at least let's talk about who this character Mordecai is in part of our metaphor. The king has committed himself to a regimen of committing himself to find a way to live in moderation, to be able to use the physical parts of his personality in a healthy way. And as a result, he receives an additional gift. And this is something that the philosophy works of the medieval texts, together with Jewish philosophical texts, talk about. That all a person has to do is express his desire to live a proper and good life, and he will receive heavenly gifts to lead him in that direction. Chazal say it in the following way: the derech sha'adam rotza leilech molichan osa, that a person is led along the path in which he wishes to go. However, this idea was refined further by Aristotelian rabbinic thinkers as well as Islamic thinkers, who talked about a certain kind of gift that comes from heaven that endows a person with certain intellectual prowess that is not of his own design. There's an idea in medieval philosophy called the Seichel HaPoel, the active intellect. And the Seichel HaPoel is a very long and complicated discussion. It finds its roots in Aristotelian writings, but which were later developed by people that came after Aristotle, and that were eventually adopted by Islamic and Jewish philosophers. And the idea of the Seichel HaPoel is that there is this angelic entity that is sort of an intermediary force between God and the world. In certain texts, he's also known as the Sar HaOlam, the angel of the earth, sort of a manifestation of God that man can interact with. And this Sar HaOlam, this sort of angelic entity, is also in charge of endowing the human beings who are so inclined to achieve greatness in life, to receive certain intellectual gifts. I see, says God, that you are striving for intellectual greatness. The active intellect will sort of zap you with eureka moments to help you reach your higher potential. That kind of intellectual spark that comes from heaven is known as Mordecai HaYehudi, according to the Rama. That's known as Mordecai the Jew. And that is, Achashverosh represents the inherent intellect that every person is born with. And Mordecai represents the acquired intellect that comes from heaven. Sefer HaAkedah, the commentary called Akedas Yitzchak by Rabbi Yitzchak Rama, who is a medieval Torah commentary, writes that there are really three types of spiritual personas that emerge within man. One he calls the Seichel Hiyulani. He calls the unformed intellect, the intellect that I'm born with. The next one is called Seichel Hanikneh, the intellect that I work on by reading and studying and learning my entire life to hone and perfect my intellect. And the final level of intellect is Seichel HaNe'etzal, is the eureka that comes from heaven, the kind of intellectual gifts that a person can be endowed with once he's demonstrated his efforts to become intellectually proficient. And so therefore that's what's represented by Mordecai, these gifts of intellect that go beyond the natural tendencies of the individual. And the reason why it's called Mordecai, Chazal tell us that Mordecai comes from the words Mira Dachya, which means crushed incense, in that this ennobled intellect that man acquires is a fragrant and pleasant kind of addition to man's personality. It's known as Yehudi, as the Judean or the Jew, because the tendency is more for Jewish people to acquire this attenuated intellect. Jews have this propensity towards study, towards reaching towards higher spiritual and intellectual goals, and as a result he's called Mordechai HaYehudi, the Jewish fragrance. What is Jewish fragrance? What is that which is the hallmark of the Jewish people and sort of underscores something that is a unique feature, a very positive feature about the Jewish people? That is our pursuit for greatness, our pursuit for intellectual greatness. Okay. And then we talk about who this Mordecai was. In Pasuk 6 it says, Asher Hagla Mirushalayim. He was exiled from Jerusalem. Im Hagola Asher Haglasa Im Yechanya Melech Yehuda. That he was exiled together with one of the last kings of Israel, Yechanya, the king of Judah, Asher Hegla Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel, who was exiled by King Nebuchadnezzar of Bavel. And continuing along this metaphor, the intellect that a person acquires from heaven emanates from a very heavenly and spiritual realm called Yerushalayim Shel Mala, the upper realm of Jerusalem. Yerushalayim representing this heavenly realm where Mordecai emanates from and enters into a person's life. It is exiled into the physical existence of our world, because this physical world is called the Galus, so to speak, for spiritual entities. This intellect comes with Yechanya Melech Yehuda. That is, it is an intellect that helps prepare a person, because the word Yechanya means from the word lahachin. It helps prepare a person, and it comes from Hashem, who is the Melech Yehuda, who is the king of Judah in this pasuk. Okay, and as I mentioned, the intellect comes to man via the active intellect, and the active intellect is alluded to in this pasuk as well by being called Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel. Because if the active intellect is the Sar Ha'olam, is the sort of the angelic force that God assigns as the intermediary angel that's in charge of the whole world, so then Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of the entire civilized world at a time, and therefore it's appropriate to call this active intellect by the name Nebuchadnezzar. We go on. And by the way, I have to point out that I am skipping a lot of the esoteric stuff that Rav Moshe Isserles writes. I'm trying to extract the things that are sort of the highlights of his commentary. There's a lot more depth which I am overlooking and I'm skipping over, so with apologies to Rav Isserles.
That also implies good fragrance.
Yes, exactly.
And that's how she's mentioned first.
That's right, very good, excellent. Vayhi omenes Hadassah. And here he is supporting Hadassah. He Esther Bastodo, who is Esther, his cousin, Ki ein la ava'im, because she has no mother and father. And it says that she is quite beautiful and nice to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai takes her as a daughter. So using our metaphor, Mordecai represents man's intellect and is able to raise his cousin Esther, who represents the part of his personality which is drawn towards the physical. But he's able to control and shape her into proper character, because she has no mother and father. That is, the new physical side of the human being breaks free of its physical roots, breaks free of its mother and father, and is willing to go over to the side of the intellect, is willing to allow it to be made into a malleable product in the hands of the Mordecai, in the hands of the intellect. This is how the baser sides of man's personality become a daughter to the intellect, who's embodied by the man Mordecai. And so Esther is taken to the palace, and we are told in Pasuk 9, we're skipping a little bit, we are told in Pasuk 9, Vatitav hana'ara ve'einav, that the maiden finds favor in Achashverosh's eyes. Vatisa chesed lifanav, and she is the object of chen, or kindness, in the eyes of Achashverosh. Vayivahelis tamrukeha vesmanoseha loses la. Actually, this pasuk is not so much the. This is. This is Haggai, who finds favor, who sees that Esther is a wonderful young lady. Haggai sees that she's a wonderful lady, and she finds favor in all who see her, and he tries to offer her all of these different kinds of cosmetics to prepare her to meet the king. And the pasuk reflects on the fact that even though man is willing to have his baser side subjugated to his intellect, he must constantly feed his physical side with food and nutrition. Meaning that you can't neglect your physical needs. If a person wants to be able to have a healthy attitude towards the physical world, he has to be able to know how to properly indulge the physical components of his personality. And this is represented in this verse of Vayishaneha ve'esna aroseha l'tov beis anoshim, that Esther is provided with all she needs in the house of the maidens. And that's what a person has to learn to do, is to be able to indulge his physical side without being ruled by it. In Pasuk 10 it says, Lo higida Esther es amah ve'es moladata, that Esther does not reveal her nationhood and her birthplace. Mordecai had told her not to give out too much information. And that is, in this metaphor, that Esther does not completely subjugate herself to Achashverosh, because after all, the body must reserve some sense of self-preservation. And this is alluded to by Esther not revealing her identity and keeping it a secret from man's more intellectual side. Now, verses 12 through 15 describe a contrast between the other maidens and Esther. You notice that all of the other maidens were offered all different kinds of perfumes and cosmetics to beautify themselves, and they took advantage for 6 months of all of the different perfumes, all of the different cosmetics. This alludes to the opportunity that man has when he comes into the world to beautify himself and indulge in the pleasures of the world. However, this is not good for him in the end, because if you look in Pasuk Yudalid, Pasuk 14, what does it say about those maidens who adorned themselves with all of the different pleasantries that they were offered? It says in the Pasuk, Va'erev hi va'a, uvaboker hi shava el beis hanoshim sheni, that in the evening she would come out. In other words, you'll have a great time in the evening of existence, which is this world. Olam hazeh is known as the night of existence. But uvaboker, in the afterlife, in Olam haba, hi shava, you'll have to come back. Meaning alluding to reincarnation. If you just indulge yourself with the cosmetics and the pleasantries of this world, so then you're going to have to end up coming back, El Beis Noshim Sheni, back to the house of maidens, back into this world once again. But by contrast, Esther is different. So we look at Pasuk Tesvav, Pasuk 15, and it says, Uvahagia Tor Esther bas Avichai dod Mordecai, that when it was Esther's turn, and Esther was taken as Mordecai's daughter, so once again we have that allusion to the fact that this is the physical personality that is subjugated by the man's intellect. She doesn't seek anything for herself, only those things which Haggai say are absolutely necessary. And so this is a reason why she finds favor in all who see her, and this once again represents man's attitude towards physical indulgences. Don't chaparine, don't start grabbing things that you don't need. Only indulge in the physical to the extent that Haggai says you need it, that your intellectual conversant tells you need to partake in. Now, when did Esther's selection take place? If we take a look, just a little bit of an interlude. Pasuk 16 tells us, Vatilakach Esther el hamelach Achashverosh, that Esther was taken to the king Achashverosh, B'chodesh ha'asiri hu chodesh Teves, in the 10th month, which is the month of Teves. Now, Bishnas Sheva L'Malchuso, in the 7th year of his reign. So, without going into too much detail into some of the other more esoteric things that the Rama says, he does actually have a bit of a departure over here, and he wants to let us know that this was actually a specific date on the calendar in the month of Teves. It turns out that this was on the 9th of Teves. Now, how does the Rama know that this was on the 9th of Teves? So, the Rama here quotes a very interesting halacha in Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says, it quotes from a text called Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther is an ancient text that was known to the Gemara, which talks about days in which you're not permitted to fast. And also, there's an auxiliary text which talks about days which are customary to fast during the Second Temple era. We only have a few vestiges of those dates in which we're supposed to fast. Some examples are Shivasar B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz. We have Tisha B'Av. We have Asara B'Teves. Those are dates that were given to us, passed down to us from the Nevi'im, and therefore we have them even to this day. But there were other dates in the calendar where people had accustomed to fast because of tragic things that had happened in the ancient world, especially during the Second Temple era or leading up to the Second Temple era. To the point where we find it codified in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tav Kuf Pei, Bishmona B'Teves Nichtava HaTorah Yavanis, that there was a custom to fast on the 8th day of Teves. Actually, there was a custom to fast 3 consecutive days, the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th of Teves. And the Shulchan Aruch explains why the 8th, 9th, and 10th. Now, of course, you could eat at night, just like Ramadan, right? So people would, I guess in the times when this custom was extant, people would eat the night before, they fast all day the 8th of Teves, and then they eat in the night. And the same thing with the 9th, and same thing with the 10th. So what happened on the 8th of Teves? So it says in Megillat Esther, the Torah was translated into Greek. And that in itself was a tragedy in the sense that the Torah now became cheapened to a certain extent. It became more accessible to the outside world. And because the Torah is compared to this beautiful wife of the Jewish people, it becomes overexposed. And that's not something considered to be a good thing. And this is, of course, a reference to the Septuagint. The Septuagint was proliferated on the 8th of Teves. Then it says, V'hayachoshech ba'olam shlosha yomim, and as a result there was darkness in the world for 3 days. The question is, we also know what happened on the 10th of Teves, because that is the date when the city of Yerushalayim was besieged. And this marked the beginning. The Babylonian siege of Yerushalayim begins on the 10th of Teves, and this marks the beginning of the end. But what happened on the 9th of Teves? So the Shulchan Aruch says, Uvetesbo lo noda eza hi hatzara she'irabo. It is unknown. What happened, what sad event happened on the 9th of Teves. Now, if you look in the Mishnah Berurah, because the Mishnah Berurah discusses this as well, since during the Slichos that we say on Asara B'Teves, we do make mention of also the 8th and the 9th, and it makes mention in one of the Piyutim that on the 9th of Teves, this is the yahrzeit of Ezra HaSofer. And because he died on this day, we fast because it represented a loss for the Jewish people. But not everyone agrees with that, and it's also something, it seems very clear that the Shulchan Aruch and the earlier commentators are trying to hide something over here. There are other theories, and perhaps that'll be a shir for another time. There's a theory that this is the yahrzeit of a man named Shimon Kippur, or Peter Simon, or Simon Peter, who was the first bishop of Rome, i.e. the first pope. And there's a legend in the Midrash that says that he was Jewish, and that he was a covert Jew, he was a plant, and that he made some very serious changes to early Christianity in order to protect Judaism, and he made many edicts that would protect the Jewish people from persecution. And as a result, we observe his yahrzeit by fasting on the day that he died. And the reason why this has not been popularized is because it would be a shanda for the Goyim if they knew that we were fasting on the date of the yahrzeit of the very first pope. So therefore it was never publicized what the 9th of Teves is. Comes along Rav Moshe Isserles and says, no, that's not why we fast on the 9th of Teves. It was because that's the day that Esther was taken to Achashverosh. She says, you see this pasuk that says it was during the month of Teves? It was none other than the 9th of Teves. So now let's get to the end of the chapter because we're almost out of time. It relates the story of Bigsan and Teresh. Bigsan and Teresh, according to the Rama, suggests that this is also an allusion to a period in a person's life. Even when you become mature, you're still not out of the forest. You can still be misled. But Bigsan and Teresh are not physical detractors of lust and of getting mired in the physical desires of this world. Rather, they represent intellectual arguments that can lead a person astray, arguments of atheism and theological distortions that can contaminate a person's thoughts and ultimately destroy him spiritually. The reason why they are given these names is because these names allude to man's ejection from the Garden of Eden, and that Bigsan has the same letters is Beginat in the garden, and Teresh comes from the word Yerusha, meaning that man was supposed to inherit the garden, but he failed to do so. However, the human being is once again saved by his intellect, who wards off even the seductive theological and esoteric arguments of Bigtan and Teresh. And that's why Mordecai, who embodies this ennobled intellect of man, comes to the rescue and is able to thwart the attempts of Bigtan and Teresh. And what is the fate of these two people? Vayivukash hadavar vayimatzei in pasuk chaf gimel vayitalu shenehem al eitz. These two men are hanged on a tree. Now this idea of hanging on a tree occurs a few times in Megillat Esther. We're going to see it later on when we talk about the hanging of Haman and his 10 sons. The imagery and the metaphor of hanging someone on a tree is that in order to defeat this evil persona, this evil entity that exists within man, you've got to hang that part of your personality on the tree. What tree are we talking about? Eitz Chaim Hi Lama Chazikim Ba, the tree of life, because ultimately we'll see that Haman embodies Yetzer Hara incarnate, and in order to subdue the Yetzer Hara, you've got to hang him on the tree of Torah. Barasi Yetzer Hara, Barasi Lo Torah Tablin, as the Gemara says, I created the Yetzer Hara, and the Torah is the ultimate cure from him. So this event of Bigtan and Teresh is really a foreshadowing of the greater and more formidable foe that the human being Achashverosh is going to encounter in the ensuing chapters, and that's Haman, as we'll encounter beginning next week. Okay, any questions or comments?